closed. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this elective session entitled by our colleagues at IHE, Managing the Transition to the Office for Students. My name's Rob Stroud. I'm Head of Alternative Provider Intelligence and Engagement at HEFCE. I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague Jenny Bradley from the Department for Education, and we're going to do a bit of a double header. So there'll be a bit of a jarring moment where we sort of cross over about halfway through this session. I'm going to do my bit from a HEFCE perspective. Jenny will do her bit from the DFE perspective, and then we'll take questions together jointly at the end. So, without further ado. I had to entitle my presentation Alternative Provider Engagement the Next 4 Months, because actually that's about how far we are away now from the Office for Students actually beginning to gear up and actually take on the functions. And the Office for Students will come into being on the 1st of January next year. Which is obviously just over a month away. But as those of you that heard Nicola Dandridge speaking yesterday, you'll know that it doesn't start to actually really get going until the 1st of April, which will in fact be the 3rd of April, the 1st of April being Easter Sunday, and it's never a good idea to start a regulatory body on April Fool's Day, I think. This is my 3rd appearance now at an IHE / Study UK conference. So I think I've made the hat trick of 3 in a row, and I was trying to work out if any other speakers have done that. But I'm delighted to be invited back again. The first year I came to speak to the Study UK conference alongside one of my DFE colleagues at that point, we were talking to you then about the setting up of a new function of engaging with alternative providers. That was very much in its infancy at that stage. We'd been going then for about 2.5 months with the actual process of engagement that we've been operating. We were very much still finding our feet and feeling our way. Last year my presentation was all about things that you need to know and do. And today I'm combining a bit of both of those two. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the activity that we've been doing through our engagement efforts, and also some of the things that you need to know and do. As I say, thanks to Independent HE as well for inviting us back. I think it's really interesting actually for me coming in each year to this conference to see how they've developed and changed. I really welcome the publication of your new strategy document, which I think is very interesting. And a few years ago I was at the launch of the manifesto document that IHE did, which turns out to be quite a prescient document now. So yeah, we're delighted to be here to be supporting this conference. So what am I going to speak about today? I'm going to talk with a brief review of the AP engagement activity that we've been undertaking since the AP Intelligence Unit, the joint unit between ourselves and the DFE, formed in 2015. I'm going to talk about some of the current priorities and planned activity from a HEFCE perspective. And you know, those of you that have worked with us will know that the HEFCE role in our joint unit is leading the engagement with alternative providers in order to help our colleagues in the Department for Education be effective in their regulation of the sector. And then as a way of segueing into Jenny's presentation, I'm going to give a sort of brief slide on the future. Of course, HEFCE has no future, ending on the 31st of March, but there is definitely a future for higher education regulation, and an exciting one it is. So, AP engagement through the ages, and doesn't it seem a long time ago now, the 14-15 academic year in distant memory, that is when at HEFCE it was decided that we needed to work at a greater level of engaging with alternative providers. Our Chief Executive, Madeleine Atkins, when she started in her post in early 2014, very much sort of read the tea leaves and identified that there was a greater need for all sector bodies to have a greater understanding of alternative providers. And I think indeed over the last 3 years we've seen all bodies that we work with, colleagues at the QAA, colleagues at HEFCE, JISC who are here as well, have all been developing their understanding and their engagement with alternative providers. 2014-15 was quite a challenging environment. We saw in that year an urgent application of student number controls by BIS in about November 2014, when there was a recognition that the alternative provider part of the HE sector was beginning to effectively overheat. We had Home Office action going on with a number of non-designated providers, where we saw the Home Office taking action following a BBC Panorama report, interestingly enough. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We had the National Audit Office producing a report into student loan financing and alternative providers, which then led to the Christmas present none of us really wanted, the Public Accounts Committee hearing in December 2015, which represented, I think, the watershed moment for the way in which the regulatory bodies within the sector were going to engage with alternative providers. So that led to the development of structured engagement with providers for the very first time. And our colleagues in the Department for Education, BIS at that time, came to HEFCE and said, can you help us out? And that's what we've been doing since. I want to say, it's interesting looking at that list of things, actually how things feel a little similar at this moment in time. We've recently had a National Audit Office report into student loan financing at alternative providers. We're very conscious, and we've heard in a number of other sessions, there's a great deal of public discourse at the moment about higher education, the way that it's managed, governed, regulated. But this is also, I think, quite different in terms of a watershed moment where we are at the moment. The new regulatory regime that we're moving into, well, for a start, is backed up at the moment with 544 pages of consultation, which is not something we had in 2014-15, when government had to react very quickly and decisively, almost overnight, to put in place new controls for the sector then. What we're seeing now, I think, is a watershed moment in terms of a considered and developed approach and hopefully a smooth transition, as you heard Nicola Dandridge saying yesterday, into a new regulatory environment for higher education. The formation of our joint unit between the DFE and HEFCE was a significant investment in resource. There were probably fewer than 10 people in total at the end of 2014 that were working on alternative provider activity across HEFCE and across the BIS, as it then was. And so that grew quite significantly overnight as we moved into early 2015. And we were really able to start mobilizing that resource at the start of the 15-16 academic year. And that's allowed us to gain lots of new information, lots of new insights in relation to alternative providers. So at HEFCE, we've sort of been on a bit of a 3-year journey with regards to alternative provider engagement. Our first year, that 15-16 academic year, was very much about getting to know the providers that were in place among the sector. That was almost quite a one-size-fits-all exercise of going out, talking to you about similar things, and being able to get an understanding of the levels that each provider were operating at. The second year, we spent developing a nuanced and proportionate engagement approach for all providers. The idea behind that being that, you know, our first year understanding of you led us to understand that some of you very much understood the regulatory environment in which you were operating, were free to operate in that. As autonomous institutions, you knew what you were doing, and really you just wanted us to keep you updated on a few other things. There were other providers at that time who came to us very clearly saying, my goodness, I've moved into this regulated environment. I've now been in it for sort of 12 months. We really need help with understanding what it is we're doing. We really need your guidance on what it is we need to do to be compliant. And this was not about us telling them, all right, well, you need this system or you need this process, but it's about guiding them around what the sort of compliance activities they need to be aware of. And we've been doing that since then, and I hope those of you that have had the opportunity to engage with myself or my team, and indeed our counterparts in the DFE, have found that since that point, we've been much more able to offer an effective point of contact for you in terms of understanding higher education regulation. So where are we now? This is our third year of operation. Time has flown by, and really now we're operating a model of quite bespoke engagement. Each of you in the room will know, if you engage with people from my team, how we want to work with you and how you want to work with us. Some of you we speak to quite regularly. Some of you we check in with a couple of times a year, and it's very much depending on your needs. But the other thing that we need to do now, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, is preparation for the future. Where are we going to go in the next sort of 3 to 4 months before HEFCE ceases to exist and the Office for Students comes into being? I want to give you a bit more detail on sort of what we've been doing. One of the things that's really important for us when we set out is the engagement that we have with you has to have a purpose. There is no point us just coming to talk to you for the sake of talking to you. It's very much engagement that we have to support DFE's efforts in regulation, and also engagement with you to support effectively your incubation into a more complex regulatory environment than existed prior to 2014-15. We've done that in a variety of ways, some of which are visible, very visible to you as providers. I have on here, and this is when I compiled this a couple of weeks ago, we've conducted over 250 visits to providers in that time. It's actually a little closer to 300. I didn't want to say 300 because I couldn't quite be sure that I was giving a truthful and factual perspective. I know it's more than 250 though. We've also spent a lot of time working with stakeholder groups, including independent higher education and other groups in the sector that represent particular interests, where they represent particular groups of colleges. We also have supported the engagement with stakeholder groups, stakeholder bodies as well within the higher education sector. So our colleagues at the DFE have been able to facilitate much more effective communication with their partners in the regulatory landscape, the QAA, the Student Loans Company, and so on. And indeed, from HEFCE's perspective, you'll know if you've ever faced any challenges with your HEFCE return process, more often than not, you'll also get a phone call from my team, as you will from HEFCE as well. So it's very much about, we've been about building relationships across the regulatory landscape in order to ensure that it's effective. We've run some conferences for you, and we've also done some other scenes behind, other things behind the scenes, sort of pulling the strings on some other things in the aim of supporting alternative providers. We've supported our colleagues in the TEF team, for example, at HEFCE, and also in the last year with all of providers coming to the National Student Survey for the first time. We've actually done a tremendous amount of work from my team, engaging with those other teams that come out and deliver those things to you to make sure that they're engaging on an appropriate level. I was challenged at the survey, the independent HE's survey, the launch of the results earlier in the summer. I was challenged by an IHE member of saying, oh, you know, we've been doing this, that, and the other. And he said to me, well, that's all very well, Rob, but what are you doing to tell people publicly about that? I thought, oh, well, that's nice. It's always been part of our plan to develop that, but there's no point us rushing out at the very first opportunity telling you what we've learned in the last 5 minutes. We've published this autumn the first 2 of a series of 3 blogs on the HEFCE website, sharing information about alternative providers at a very high level, because we recognise still that in some parts of even within the higher education sector, there hasn't been an understanding of APs that perhaps we might have expected there to be or wanted there to be. So we have been doing work to make sure that that knowledge and that information gets out there. We've also, as I said, been doing briefings for other organisations, other sector groups, and also internally to others within the higher education regulatory space. We're really pleased. I mentioned earlier the National Audit Office reported again this year into student loan financing, and the intelligence unit, the joint unit between ourselves and colleagues in the DFE, was highlighted within that as something that now has enhanced the oversight of the sector. And that was something I think that we're really proud of within both DFE and within HEFCE, that we've been able to do that, and we've been able to do that in a manner that's been collaborative and working with you as a sector. So, what are we going to do now? I thought I would, give you an overview of, from a HEFCE perspective, what is it are we actually focusing on at the moment? And I thought, as I was putting these slides together, I probably couldn't get away with not mentioning the BBC Panorama broadcast from a couple of weeks ago that I'm sure many of you will have seen. And in fact, I actually thought... Yes, yes. Those of you that were at the dinner last night may find me with a slightly different take on proceedings. I think I need to acknowledge with you as a stakeholder group, as a group of alternative providers, that this is something that obviously ourselves in the Department for, and our colleagues in the Department for Education take very, very seriously. And we have been working behind the scenes on that since before that programme was broadcast, on dealing with the matters around it. And I just want to give some sort of assurance to you as a group of stakeholders in the higher education sector that we will seek to act where it is necessary to act and where there is evidence to do so. So it has taken up a tremendous amount of resource in the last few weeks. Yes, easy, says Jenny. Does it all the time, I'm sure. But it's something that we have been focusing on and will continue to focus on to make sure that the regulatory outcomes are the right ones from the Department for Education's perspective, and also from the HEFCE perspective, our role in protecting the and forming the conditions for a world-leading higher education system. The other major thing that we obviously have been doing very recently is the annual redesignation process, or the annual monitoring process for those of you with degree awarding powers. From the HEFCE perspective, with the exception of a couple of providers who know who they are, we have largely completed that evaluation now, and our assessments are now flowing forth into the Department for Education to enable them to start making their annual redesignation decisions. You'll be pleased to know that this is earlier than ever before, and indeed the DFE are already starting to take decisions around that, and we'll start to sort of work through that with a growing pace as we lead up to Christmas and into January. The other thing we have also been doing is supporting our colleagues as we've been going out on our engagement of recording queries that have been raised in relation to the DFE consultation. I won't say too much about that because Jenny's going to talk about that in greater detail in a moment. We have coming up very soon the HEFCE deadline. This will be the last HEFCE exercise that HEFCE conducts, but obviously we will see if the Office for Students are picking that up in the future. For those of you that have to do a HEFCE return, I will remind you that it's a strict deadline of noon on the 14th of December. The system switches off at noon. If you try and upload at 12:05, you will struggle to do so because it will say that that is closed. One of the things I'm really pleased about this year is we've been able to streamline some of the activities that we then do behind the scenes in relation to the verification activity, so that what you should find this year from your provider perspective is that we come out to you a lot faster with information and the queries that you then have to respond to us on in order to get your data signed off. We are hoping this year, providing that you are still in your colleges, I know some of you closed down for Christmas actually quite soon after that, but provided you're still in the college and working up to the Christmas break, so are we, and we hope to get as many of you signed off early on as possible, so that after Christmas you don't come back with that hanging over you in January. We've also this year developed new guidance and some new online training resources as well. We recognise that last year it can be quite onerous for providers to keep attending events, especially in this really busy period of the year. So there's a lot of new resources on the HEFCE website where you can go on, access them any time of the day or night. If you're doing a HEFCE return at home at the weekend, it's available there for you to watch a sort of recorded training session with some interactive quizzes and things like that. We've been supporting provider engagement with TEF Year 3. Those of you that were in the elective session earlier with my colleague Graham Rosenberg will know that he focused on a number of the activities that they've been undertaking with regards to TEF Year 3. If you are thinking of participating in TEF, you've probably heard from us. The TEF Provider Intentions Survey has recently gone out, and this is just a plug from me as well. If you are thinking of participating in the TEF, please do respond to that survey. It doesn't commit you to anything, but it helps our team and the TEF team plan what resources needed for that in the future. We've also been doing some work engaging on some specific projects. Some of you have participated in a small project that we've been operating across the HE sector, so with HEFCE-funded institutions as well, looking at quality arrangements in small providers. We've also, as Alex Proudfoot mentioned yesterday, following really sort of some impetus from Independent HE, we've been working with the Leadership Foundation to undertake a project on governance, which you're not hearing about because you're in this room. But if you're in the other room, you would be hearing about that. But we will be coming out to contact about quarter to a third of providers very, very shortly to invite you to participate in a project on looking at governance. And generally, in addition to all the other stuff that's going on in the sector as well, it's also business as usual with provider engagement. We're still here if you want to ring us up and ask us questions about what's going on, what do you need to do, how can we help you, that sort of thing. So plans for 2018. So the plan is that HEFCE formally ceases to exist on the 31st of March 2018. I want to make it very clear, this came up a few times over dinner with Nicola Dandridge last night, for those of you that were here. All of us as HEFCE staff are transferring over to the Office for Students. So all of that knowledge and information that sort of I keep in my head and my colleagues keep in their heads comes across with us on into the Office for Students on the 1st of April. What we don't know yet is how the OFS will operationally deliver what it needs to deliver. The OFS is going to be a very different organisation to HEFCE. It has to be in order to deliver the outcomes that are expected of it by the Higher Education and Research Act and indeed by the colleagues in the Department for Education and the government priorities. So that's really important, I think, as a takeaway message for you, that that you need to be aware that you will be dealing with a different body, even if some of the names are the same people that you've been working with previously. One of the things that's very, very important at the moment is talking about how we engage with you as providers. That's, again, a question that I was asked a few times yesterday. And we will, again, that's up for grabs at the moment. And one of the things that you can do as part of your consultation responses to the regulatory framework that Jenny will be talking about in a minute or so, is actually feedback how you want to be engaged with as providers. I know some of you have fed back, that you value some of the types of engagement activity that we've undertaken with you. So please, I urge you, if you have a view, make it known, because the timetable on this is so very tight, there will probably not be another opportunity for people to be coming back to you and asking you further follow-up information. So get your consultation responses in by the 22nd of December, with all of that information and everything. Get it all off your chest before Christmas, basically. Things that you need to do, you need to be aware of what's in that document. So you need to listen very carefully to Jenny in a second. And you need to be aware of the things that you will need to do. Registration for the Office for Students opens in April 2018, when the Office for Students opens its doors for the first time. If you wish to be on the Office for Students register for the 1920 academic year, and you want to be on that register at the first point that register is published, which should be in September 2018, then you need to apply in April 2018, when the Office for Students opens its doors. That's all set out in the provider roadmaps that are in that consultation document. But I really want to reiterate that. If you miss that boat, you may find yourself somewhat later on in the process. Effectively, this replaces the annual redesignation process that you've been working with HEFCE on over the last few years. So you will need to register in April, and that replaces this annual redesignation cycle that you've been going through each September. That will no longer exist under the new system. So that's what we're going to do. That's where we're going to be. Like I say, I can't say at the moment what we're going to be doing post the 31st of March. And I'll leave it to you to help shape that in your consultation responses. I want to leave you with this. This is George Bush on the USS Abraham Lincoln in 2003, a few months after the Iraq War and the toppling of Saddam Hussein. And this is known as his mission accomplished speech. And of course, anyone knows any sort of history in recent times will know that it was far from mission accomplished with the people of Iraq at that time. And I think we're at a similar sort of moment. Mission accomplished, you've heard level playing field mentioned. I stopped taking a tally. It got to too many by sort of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. we have the regulatory level playing field coming. That is going to be happening. There is still a lot of work to do, both in the transition and then in the future, as you all adjust and we adjust to the new regulatory arrangements. In the new year, my team, as part of their engagement activity, will be seeking to engage with all of the designated providers at the moment, either just through a telephone call or perhaps some focused visits, just to make sure you understand what is going to happen after the 31st of March. So I want you all to be ready for that and hopefully be ready with questions that you may have in the new year. And also, while I'm here today, I've spoken to a few providers who are new to the system or want to come into the system in the future. And this is really an open offer to you all, that if you want to have a discussion about the new arrangements, please do get in touch with me and my team at HEFCE. We can either answer some of that ourselves, we can come out and see you in the new year when I should have some resource available to do that, or indeed we can put you in touch with the right people in the Department for Education if you have specific queries. The key message to all providers, whether you're currently in the regulated system or outside it in some way, is that until the 31st of March, our plan is to really focus on whether or not you are ready and understand the registration requirements. So yes, mission accomplished, but still a lot of work to do. Thank you very much. And I shall now seamlessly swap over to Jen.
Just make sure that I've got this working. There we go. So hello, and thank you all for staying to listen to our section, and thanks Rob for a really informative and great start there. So I'm going to primarily focus on the new regulatory framework. Bear with me, I've just lost my notes. So sorry. There we go. So many of you will have heard Nicola Dandridge, if you were here yesterday, of the new Office for Students CEO speak. Perhaps already have spoken about the regulatory framework and the consultation event, and you may have been to a consultation event. So the chance some of you might have heard what I'm going to say today, so apologies. However, I know that some of you won't have, and I was speaking to a few people over dinner. And not everybody does know how this regulatory framework is going to work. We have lots of people who may have been engaged with the regulatory framework already. And we may have people who might not have been. I appear to have just rested that somewhere badly. However, so here we go. So the regulatory framework consultation. There is actually, as Rob pointed out, a rather large suite of consultation documents. And the regulatory framework consultation, which we launched on behalf of the OFS last month. And there are a suite of 5 consultations. So one, particularly on the regulatory framework itself. So this is the largest consultation, and I'm going to focus primarily on this today. But hopefully if you do have questions on any of the others, and we should have time to pick that up at the end. The OFS registration fees. And this is a 2-stage consultation. Following on from initial consultation that was run towards the end of last year, it sets out the detailed proposals on how to calculate the registration fee for the OFS based on provider size, and sets out plans to review that fee model after 2 years of its operation. We hope this is going to enable us to use a simple but proportionate approach to getting this all underway, but also gives us an opportunity to refine it later, but very much welcome your views on how you feel that might work for you. Another consultation, which I think may well be of interest to a number of you, is around degree awarding powers and university title. The plan changes to DAPS on UT are an essential part of the reforms to make it simpler for high-quality providers to enter the higher education market. This doesn't really change any of the proposals that were set out in the 2016 white paper. But it does seek to kind of give you some more information on how that will work in practice, how you might engage with that, and it includes, for example, the criteria and processes for the new types of DAPS, so such as bachelor's degree DAPS or DAPS on a probationary basis. And then 2 other consultations on the designated data body and the designated quality body, again seeking your views on the suitability of QAA and HEFCE to be those designated bodies. And, as if that isn't enough, there will be a separate consultation coming out on monetary penalties towards the end of the year as well, which will talk about how the OFS might set penalties and how that will factor itself into the regulatory framework. Oh. Don't appear to have done this very well.
You keep talking,
Thank you. So I'm going to start by setting out the approach to the overall framework. Let's just wait.
I want to duplicate. Come back.
There we go.
Oh no, I
I
don't.
don't think it was me. It must have been though.
You pressed something.
I did press something. I thought I pressed the arrow button.
What happens when I... Oh no, we don't want to do that at all. And if we did this, then you can't see it on there.
That's fine. I can.
Can we
I can
progress it?
turn. Is it this one down the bottom? No.
Yeah, this one.
No.
No. Oh, now I've lost my screen. Keep talking. Keep
Okay,
talking.
so-
Everyone will look at that screen over there, the regulatory framework one.
Can you click on? So I'm going to talk about the OFS and its primary objectives. So I'll read these out, and then they'll come on the screen. So, so the OFS has 4 primary objectives, and these are very much focused and framed around what matters to students. But we are seeking your views on these as part of the consultation as well. So if you don't think they quite hit the mark, we want to hear from you. So first of all, objective 1. All students from all backgrounds are supported to access, succeed and progress from higher education. So that's very much about access and your ability to then progress from your higher education. Objective 2. All students from all backgrounds receive a high quality academic experience and their qualifications hold value over time in line with sector recognised standards. So that's very much about the quality of your of the academic experience. Objective 3, all students from all backgrounds have their interests as consumers protected while they study, including in the event of provider, campus or course closure. And objective 4, that all students from all backgrounds receive value for money. And there they are. Thank you. So this is really at the heart of the regulatory approach. These are the OFS's regulatory objectives, and the OFS will seek to mitigate the risks that each of these 4 objectives is not met. Yes. So the OFS is going to be a market regulator, unashamedly so, and will take a risk-based approach. This means that the level of regulation will be directly proportionate to the level of risk posed by a provider. In order to regulate in this way, the OFS will monitor risks at 2 levels. 1, at sector level, where the OFS will focus on creating the conditions for competition, continuous improvement, collaboration, and informed choice within the sector, supplemented by tools to encourage and support activity that addresses those market failures. If you've ever taken the time, not only to read the consultation documents, but before that, the Higher Education Research Act, you'll have seen a number of duties which have framed how this has all come together around supporting diversity, competition, collaboration, and access and participation. And then at the provider level, and this is primarily what I'm going to focus on today, so hopefully it's of most interest to you. And this is how it will regulate providers to protect outcomes for students. And risk monitoring will primarily take place at this level. All providers must meet a high baseline, both initially and on an ongoing baseline. This is not about lowering bars to entry, although we are allowing providers to demonstrate how they meet these baselines in a less prescribed way. This means there will be an in-depth risk assessment at the point of registration, which will determine both whether or not a provider gets registered and what risks the provider might pose that have to be monitored and or mitigated. Once registered, the OFS will monitor providers on an ongoing basis. This will largely be data and information-led, including both information that must be submitted and or information or data that is available to the OFS by other means. The key point to note, I guess, here is that ongoing engagement between the OFS and providers will be proportionate to risk, and this is a change from how this is done currently under either of the regimes, We have argued, and will continue to argue, actually, that it may look more similar to the way that we engage with you, alternative providers, where we do take probably a more risk-based approach. But it will be a change for everybody. So providers that do not pose any particular risk will experience much lighter touch regulation than those that pose risks which the OFS will have to manage. Crucially, as I've said before, the OFS is going to be a market regulator and will generally not be interested in continuous improvement at the provider level. Student choice will be driving competition and continuous improvement in this space. There's one exception, and that is around access and participation, within which the baseline requirement for access and participation plan will incorporate continuous improvement. So, the OFS's regulatory approach is underpinned by the register. And providers will be subject to conditions that are proportionate to the benefits that they are accessing and the level of risk that they pose. So, all English higher education providers can apply to register. There will no longer be a differentiation between HEIs and alternative providers. We're all higher education providers in the new world. And they'll need to choose a registration category, depending on which benefits they want to access. So the categories and broad benefits haven't changed since the white paper, and some of them you'll see probably look quite familiar to how maybe the system operates, but you get the choice, which you don't currently really have at the moment. In return, providers must supply certain information to the OFS, and must subscribe to the OIA on the registered basic. So this is the category with the least regulation, offering simply a recognition that the course is on offer of a higher education standard. So in return for that, information to the OFS, and you have to subscribe to the OIA. Beyond that, there are no conditions in relation to quality, financial sustainability, etc., etc. And the OFS will make it absolutely clear to students that it can't offer assurances in that respect. The intention of this category is really to provide a way for providers currently outside of the regulatory regime altogether to be part of a recognised sector, to give transparency to students and certainty that the qualifications they are studying towards are indeed genuinely higher education, which currently they don't have. And then we move on to kind of the approved section, the middle block here. This is designed primarily for providers that wish to have access to the student loan system for their students. In addition, if providers wish to apply or hold a Tier 4 licence, degree awarding powers or university title, they must be registered in this category as a minimum. And in order to access these benefits, providers must meet stringent registration conditions around quality and financial sustainability, ones which many of you are already familiar with. Then you have the approved fee cap. This category is very similar to the approved category. However, in addition, providers can access teaching grant funding, but obviously they must abide by the fee cap, hence the fee cap. As now, that fee cap will be determined depending on whether or not an access and participation plan is in place. So, how does the OFS determine whether or not it wants to let you onto the register after you've decided where you might want to go? So these are around conditions of registration. So there are two types of conditions of registration. Initial conditions. These are conditions a provider must demonstrate it is met at the point of its initial application to join the register and on a continuous basis thereafter. And ongoing conditions. These are conditions a provider must meet once they've joined the register in order to maintain registered status. So these are the initial conditions of registration. All of the conditions are designed to maintain a high bar to entry, whilst removing some of the unnecessary barriers. For instance, those that came from being overly prescriptive in the current regulatory regime. For example, let's take financial viability and sustainability, if you can say it. So as now, that could be met by submitting past evidence of financial performance and your resources available. However, if you're a new provider or a small provider or one with a unique set of financial circumstances, it can also be met by submitting evidence of current resources, credible business plans, or even an enforceable third-party guarantee. Some of these you will see probably look quite familiar around access and participation, quality and standards. I'm just going to pause on the two at the end, student contracts and consumer law. So you will already and probably be very aware of the CMA's guidance on how the higher education sector might need to, how it can meet its obligations under consumer law. This will become a condition of registration going forward. Providers will have to demonstrate that in developing their policies and procedures, governing their contractual and other relationships with students, they've given due regard to relevant guidance as to how to comply with consumer law. And then also student protection plans. This is also something new. And the provider must have enforced a student protection plan which has been approved by the OFS, and which the OFS will look to see whether it is proportionate to the level of risk that the provider might pose to its students, and particularly around the continuation of their studies. And as I've said before, all initial conditions of registration are going to remain ongoing as well. So, ongoing conditions of registration. In addition to the initial conditions of registration, providers in the approved categories will be subject to conditions such as transparency, senior pay, information regarding subscription to the OIA, TEF, something which is new into the framework. We've proposed that providers must participate in TEF if they have more than 500 undergraduate students. That's something which wasn't in the white paper, so that is new to this consultation and a new proposition. Some of these will look familiar, I suspect. Information regarding senior pay. This is also something which has moved on since the white paper. So the proposal set out that providers must provide to the OFS and publish in their annual financial statements information on the number of its staff members earning a basic salary over £100,000 per annum, and for staff earning a basic salary of over £150,000 per annum. This information must include details of total remuneration and an explanation of how these remuneration packages were decided and justified. I won't stop on all of these. There's lots of detail in the consultation documents, but it gives you an idea around how the conditions of registration will be set. So, as I've said previously, OFS regulation is going to be risk-based, and it will be proportionate. Risk drives a level of regulatory engagement with a provider based on the likelihood of a provider breaching their registration conditions. The risk assessment will really drive the relationship between the OFS and providers. It will set how that engagement and the timeliness and the regularity of the engagement between the OFS and its providers. After the initial in-depth assessment at registration, monitoring compliance with the conditions on an ongoing basis will largely be information and data-driven. So the information and data submitted and otherwise available to the OFS will feed into lead indicators, which will help the OFS spot any potential emerging risks. However, I think it is important to clarify that no regulatory action will be taken on the basis of those lead indicators alone. The OFS would always seek to understand and make contact and talk to a provider about any changes in those lead indicators before establishing a particular change or course of action. In addition to lead indicators, there are so-called reportable events, something which is very much in line with how alternative providers are regulated now, which are things a provider must report to the OFS, changes in senior leadership, in sales and mergers. And the OFS will undertake random sampling as well, which means it will occasionally take a closer look at providers' compliance on a random as opposed to a risk basis. If the OFS described anything that indicated if the OFS discovered anything that indicated an increased risk or a breach or an actual breach of conditions, it can take a number of steps. It can submit a provider to enhanced monitoring. It could attach some specific conditions of registration, for example, an improvement plan or something of that like. And as a last resort, it will have the power to impose sanctions, including fines, suspension, or deregistration. So, here we have the timetable. So Rob already set some of this out. And as Nicola said yesterday, the OFS will be set up in January 2018, primarily to handle, in those first few months, the responses to the consultation that closes later this month. And it also intends to publish its new regulatory framework in February of March of next year, and will be open for applications in April 2018. Very much the priority, as Rob has already set out, for Nicola, for Sir Michael Barber, for the staff at HEFCE, for the OFS board, and for the staff at DFE, is to try to deliver a seamless transition. We are working through some of those details, and there are going to be some further advice and guidance and supplementary to what is already in the consultation document about how that's going to work throughout academic year 2018-19 and in advance of the new framework being fully in force in summer 2019. So I'm just going to close, again, making a plug. There are still a few weeks left to ensure that your voice is heard and for you to provide a formal response to the consultation document. We realise it is a series of tomes of consultation and that some of it will be more relevant to you than others. Do feel free to provide responses to the bits which you think are most relevant to yourselves if you don't want to go through and provide a response to all of the questions. We're very interested to hear your views. There is opportunity for things to change if you disagree with the way that the regulatory framework has been set up. I think it's fundamentally important that we understand how this can work for you, often as much smaller specialist institutions rather than just those who may have been the larger campus-based traditional universities. The OFS won't be doing its job if it can't support you to do yours in the same way as it can support the larger institutions itself. So to give you a bit of a kind of flavour, some of the emerging themes and that we've come across in the consultation events that have already been run, where there might have been some focus around the small specialist institutions, maybe similar to yourselves. So some of the concerns that we're starting to hear, concerns about the disproportionate impact of some of the aspects of what I've talked about today, how that will feel for you as organisations. Are you going to be able to respond to that, particularly, for example, around data provision and the fees? Is there going to be too much reliance on data and not enough onus on contextual information? And how will that work? The concerns around how VFM is calculated for the different types of students that will exist in the system, particularly at your institutions, as well as lots of kind of positives as well. So lots of positives around, I'm not going to use it, around having a framework which works for all providers and doesn't discriminate against size or type, where you have the choice to engage in whatever bit of the regulatory framework you want to. And also lots of kind of support for moving away from being so reliant on track record, having some more flexible approach to degree awarding powers, etc. I would say also some of the things we get is a concern around the fact that maybe not all providers want degree awarding powers, but could we do better, or can the OFS do something to support better validation across the system and make that more transparent and make providers, make those relationships work better. So I think absolutely this is how you respond. So please do. Because whilst I can ensure that we'll feed back any discussions from here and we're taking on board the discussions and the comments that might have come from other consultation events, the best way to make that formalised and the best way to make sure it's definitely counted and we get the clarity and the level of detail after you've heard us talk about it constantly to you, I suspect it may feel like, we need you to submit your formal responses as well. And that's it. That's what I'm going to say. So, Rob, I think we are open to questions.
Yeah, I've been trying to coordinate the questions of this. I'll stick my large binder next to your large binder. Great.
I'll move that.
We've got a couple. We've got one here. I'm going to actually just kick off quickly with one I think is really important to start with. Rob, in your presentation, we got to the discussions that are going to happen in the new year. What's going to happen to the designation process as we move through the Office of Students until we have the register, until we're into sort of September, October 2018? Could you kind of give us a flavour of, are we still subject to designation? Do we still have it? How's that going to work?
Yep, so at the moment, as I said, HEFCE has just undertaken the assessments that we undertake with regard to your annual redesignation applications. We're passing those on to the DFE as normal, and DFE will take decisions on that as normal and communicate that back to you. And that designation is for the 18-19 academic year, for that transition year. And during that space, although the Office for Students will have come into being, it does not take up the regulatory baton until August 2019. So for the transition year, the Department for Education and Jenny and her colleagues remain the regulator for alternative providers, and you'll be subject to the same sort of conditions of designation, etc., as you are at present. In addition to that, in that year, you will also be going through that registration process for the Office for Students. And there are some of those conditions which come into force at the point of registration. So there is some degree of overlap, but the design around that should be that it's not unnecessary overlap. Would that be fair, Jen?
Yes. So we are, and this is kind of what I alluded to, in the consultation document, I think we talk about the fact that there is a transition plan, and so we will be continuing to, and you will be designated until the start of academic year 1920, if you are designated for academic year 18-19. We are looking to see, particularly through that period, how we can use that designation process to inform your assurances around your place on the register, so that we aren't duplicating processes, so that we can, it's a similar sets of information, we can all talk to each other. So our plan is to try and figure out to make that happen, so that we're not unnecessarily duplicating regulation in the transition year. But we do need to work through some of those details.
And on that note, one of the things that many providers that aren't currently with you at the moment are looking at is, if I've got to do the same thing for Tier 4 as I have to do for designation, can I get both? So if they were then to enter in April, when would they be able to get designation? When would they be able to get student loans?
So if they apply to the OFS, they won't be able to get student loans until academic year 1920.
And if they apply in the current system,
yes,
which is your deadline is when, Rob?
So the DFE's deadline is the 31st of January, or the 28th of January, the end of January.
Yeah, so if they apply by the end of January, they can get designation.
For the academic year 18-19, and they'll have to think about whether they also then need a very similar time frame, I guess, to be thinking about making an application to the OFS.
Okay, perfect, great. Do we have the microphones in the back, guys? Yeah, can you want to come up to the front? We've got a question here in the front. Anybody else have a question? We can take them in groups. Okay, so two here, and then we'll go John, and the two people at John's table there. And then we'll come in, so we'll do these three. So right here to start with, and then we'll go in the middle of the room, and then we'll get Anne, and somebody else had their hand up in the back there.
Hello, Peter Green, Principal of London Churchill College, retiring 31st of December. I just note that in Rob's speech, the Panorama programme itself becomes a sort of part of the regulatory framework. Now, London Churchill is a for-profit college, and obviously that affects the way it behaves. And I'm really pleased to see that governance is coming into the discussion, because I think that's really important. But at the same time, it raises the question about regulation, does it not? Because obviously we have a 15-minute undercover Panorama programme on a couple of colleges, which actually trumps the fact that there was QAA reviews, there's HEFCE data, there's HEFCE data. And it does raise the question, does it not, about the regulatory framework and how it's working at the moment? Because as a member of the public, I might think, well, actually, it's failing the public if a group of undercover people can just go in there and suddenly you've got issues of potential fraud or criminal behaviour or whatever. And I'm just wondering how you're approaching the regulatory framework. I don't know whether this issue is true or not, but how you are going to promote the new regulatory framework to ensure this sort of stuff, if it is happening, doesn't happen. And if it isn't happening, if it actually isn't happening, it gives the impression that you guys coming in don't trust the outcomes of organisations like the QAA and their reviews, when certain colleges have clean bills of health maybe only 3 or 4 months ago.
Okay, great. We'll take the two questions at the table in the middle here, and we'll do it in a group of 3. So if you can pass the microphone on, we'll get that to the middle table. So John, do you want to just raise your hand, and there we go, yeah. So these two questions here, and then we'll do an answer, and then we'll come round again.
John at Richmond University. Three quick questions. One is, I'm assuming that if you are not an approved fee cap, there is no fee cap, as is the present case. So you are entitled, therefore, to charge UK, EU, or UK students as at the present moment. Second question is, so I mean, I had assumed that, but second question is, in terms of the approved fee cap, will there be, because I'm plowing through the numerous pages of the consultation document. I'm not there yet. I have to decide whether or not I read David Willett's book or I finish the consultation paper. But anyway, but certainly the question is, in terms of more information about the nature and extent and mechanisms for grant funding for alternative providers, which is quite an interesting development. And I'm assuming, therefore, that if one does get grant funding, that would not come into effect until 1920.
Okay, and it's just next to you. Yeah, go for it. We're going to take the three and then we'll answer them all.
Sure. Ben from FutureWorks in Manchester. So it's my understanding that if you've recently passed and had a successful QA review, that this will satisfy the quality assurance component under the new regime. If then we get, as we are anticipating any day now, a successful FSMG outcome for our course designation, can we expect that this also will satisfy the FSMG requirements of the new system?
Okay, so we've got three very different questions. One sort of on that reputation and trust of the system, one on a series of ones on funding, and then one on FSMGs.
Shall I kick off?
You go,
okay.
go, and then I will pitch in.
Yes, all right, I'll start with Peter's question. So I think it's important to say that the Panorama programme obviously showed a 28-minute programme which showed 3 different providers. In fact, in many cases, didn't actually show anything going on in the providers. It showed third parties that were connected with it. And so I think there is an issue there for us to consider in the future in terms of the regulatory framework about the role of third parties, because actually, you know, the people that were filmed on camera, by and large, were not people who were connected with the alternative provider. They were third-party organisations. With relation to the point you made about whether we trust the judgments and activities of other organisations, well, absolutely. But what you have to recognise, and I think Will, who I see sat back there, who was on the programme as well, made the point within that programme, quite rightly, that the things that they are looking for are different things. And that is why we need a comprehensive regulatory framework that can pick up on from a range of sources and a range of different sources of information matters of concern. So that, you know, the QAA, it is not their role to go out to East London and be hanging around outside barbershops to see if there are any transactions taking place in cars, for example. There are other methods that the OFS will be able to use, and indeed the OFS has much stronger powers given to it under the Higher Education and Research Act to go in and investigate matters than any of the existing bodies have at the moment. We have to remember that the existing regulatory arrangements that we're operating under right now are the powers under the 1992 Act, supplemented by the powers that the Secretary of State for Education has to make guidance. And that's the world in which we're operating at the moment. Whereas now we're going to move forward into a world that is underpinned by relevant and up-to-date legislation, and I think that should be welcomed. Does that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think particularly around the powers, the new powers for the OFS around the entry and search, and allowing it where it feels that it needs to, the investigatory powers that currently we struggle with within the current regulatory environment, because it's not within the powers for any of our organisations to be able to do that in the way that we might like to at times, potentially. Shall I just very quickly?
Yes, knock off a few of those.
So your assumptions were both right. So yes, approved fee cap. If you don't want, if you are in the approved, there is no fee cap. And grant funding, yes, if you choose to move into approved fee cap and you want to try to access grant funding and you're successful in doing that with regards to kind of how the grant funding policy might be set around how much there is, all those types of things, and what has been spent on at that particular time, that will not come into effect till 1920.
And then FSMG.
FSMG.
But one of the key questions
yes.
is it worth going for grant funding will be a question many institutions will
Okay.
raise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's an unknown at the moment, actually, and yes, I think the thing to look out for within that will be the direction that the Department for Education give to the Office for Students, which will operate, I think, in a similar way to HEFCE's grant letter at the moment, and that will give you an idea. Yeah,
I mean, those funding pots are subject to change, and not really at the OFS's. So the OFS will have the gift on how to spend it, but not the size of pot that it gets, or the priorities that government set it. So in a similar way now, there's a challenge in understanding whether it might be worth it. That will continue.
Yeah, and indeed that's the way that the HEFCE funding operates at the moment, and any HEFCE funded institution in any year is not guaranteed a certain level of funding. Do you want me to do
go on.
the next?
Yeah, go on.
I mean, with relation to your point about the requirements to register with the Office for Students, I think the important thing to state is the Office for Students is a body that does not yet exist, and it will be the Office for Students that make those decisions. So neither of us can sit here today and say definitively, yes, if you've got this and you get through your designation this year, green light, away you go. So it would be wrong of me to sit here and give you that assurance in that way, but at the same time, to reiterate, I think what Jenny said in her presentation and is written in the document, to make sure that we remove as much burden as possible in terms of that registration process. We will seek to, the Office for Students will seek to look at those existing review mechanisms within that. The Office for Students will determine its own risk appetite, and as Nicola Dandridge set out yesterday, the Office for Students doesn't have a fully constituted board yet, and so it's quite difficult for it to do that. And indeed, with the new regulatory powers that it's going to have, it may choose to take a different risk appetite than under the current arrangements, particularly with the goal of improving access to the sector and the system.
Excellent. All right, well, we'll take you.
Yeah, that is correct. Well done.
It might very well be, Ben, that's something that you put in your consultation document about that particular burden and how lovely it would be to have that removed by being able to use the same.
It's not even, in fact, about the work effort involved at all. It's about certainty.
Yeah, understood.
Forward to run our business, because without it, frankly, we have no business.
Yes. So I think the great thing about this new system is the fact that obviously at the moment you've just applied this September, you'll get an answer sort of December or January with regard to September 18. What you're going to be doing in April 18 and hopefully getting an answer by September 18 again is getting certainty for September 19 and beyond, because there's not that annual re-registration process that you'll go through. So absolutely certainty for providers to enable you to focus on your students and planning for the best student experience you can offer them, rather than planning on which regulatory return you're going to make and when, is sort of central to these proposals.
Excellent. We'll take Anne here in the front. Did you come up this way? Anne, you're still, so we'll do these two questions here. There was one in the back that I had skipped. Somewhere in behind Ben. So come up to the front with Anne here. So we'll do... No, Anne's here. There we go. So we'll do 1, 2... We'll do 1, 2, 3, and we'll do 4. And we'll try and round this up here. Sorry, we're a little bit out of time. We're going to do 4 at a time. Go for it.
Okay, Anne Evans from Pearson College. I think it's probably quite a quick question. I just wanted to make sure that I had understood properly what Rob was saying about course designation. If we were to... design and validate a new programme in the new year, let's say March, April, May, for delivery in September 2018, how would that work? At the moment, we're allowed to send requests for designation as and when. Will that continue right up to cover the 18-19 academic year?
Well, so certainly if you get it done in the new year, then depending on when you get it done, you'll either be making an application to HEFCE under the normal arrangements. So if you get it validated, say 1st of March, you're ready to go, you can apply on the 1st of March, it will be stuck on the register and ready to go, and indeed then there'll be the transition year, so the intention is you will apply to the OFS.
Okay, so after the 1st of April, the same thing would just go to the OFS instead of to HEFCE?
Yeah, that is part of the detail of the transition arrangements that needs to be probably more clearly expressed.
Okay.
think that is our intent, though. The intent is not to change your ability to designate courses in year as you would now for the start of 2018, for the academic 18-19.
Yeah.
I think the challenge we will have in the transition period is that it may be more difficult for us just to kind of manage those. So our plea is to try and get them in as early as possible next year for everybody's sake, to some extent, to make sure that you can get a decision in the time frame you want it. But the intention is not to try and remove your ability to get courses designated in year for the 18-19 academic year.
So the reason my question is precisely to know whether we should be rushing to get it in before, the end of February or something. It sounds like that might not be a bad idea.
It probably
not
a bad idea, just to make sure that we can get you a decision in a timely way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if it's a new course and you get it in before then, a new course registration at an existing location only takes 2 to 3 days to process.
Yes, they've been very quick recently.
Okay, we have really short questions here and here. Just conscious
really short. If I've just been through an annual monitoring visit from QAA in the last month or so, will I be having another annual monitoring visit this time next year?
Tier 4. Is this for Tier 4? Or is this just in...
No, just part of QAA's oversight.
Yeah,
The annual monitoring cycle.
Yeah, it's Tier 4. I think with regards to, and I think it's a similar question, I think, if you're, and it kind of depends, because if it's just about Tier 4, and you're...
No.
It's not. Okay, so...
It's annual monitoring post-HER review.
Okay. So with regards, and this is a similar kind of question, I think, into kind of what will meet the registration conditions, in the fact that we need to work through exactly how the transition year will work with regards to ensuring that you're still meeting any conditions of either designation for 18-19, and also how that works with how the OFS then wants to make sure that you're meeting any conditions of registration. So I think the answer is we don't know, but we know that we need to figure out how that will work and tell you quite soon.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, can we come over this way quickly? There we go.
Hi, I'm Fiona Paul from Matrix College. We're a really small 65-student alternative provider of counselling, so very specialist. We're a counselling college. I'm just sitting here. I've been sitting all day really aware of the reduction in numbers of alternative providers over the few years. Am I wrong? And, well, I guess my question is... my anxiety very much is the cost. We're just about holding on. For a small provider with 65 students, £15,000 for an HER review is an enormous part of our budget every year, and I'm now really worried about what the costs are going to be for the OFS compared to what we're paying for HEFCE now, and just wondering if anyone's done those sums, or if when alternative providers, small alternative providers like us shut, whether you know why they're shutting down, and whether anyone takes that into consideration when you think about the banding, particularly for small providers like us.
So I think this isn't the... I don't know about the change in the number of alternative providers, but with regards to kind of the fee model, I would encourage you and obviously, because it isn't the first time we've heard this, and particularly whether we've got the banding right and those types of things. I'm very, very interested to hear. And also, if you do have views on not just the way in which the fee model for the OFS will work, but the cumulative impact of the different types of things that you feel you need to pay for to be part of the regulatory system, part of this co-regulatory system, and understands it. So we do recognise that this is a challenge, but I would encourage you to feed back, because you're not the first provider, and if therefore the fee model needs looking at, that's what we want to hear in the responses.
There's an enormous difference between a college with 200 students to 65. How much an HER visit costs?
Yeah, and we agree. I think we'll have to skip the reasons why. We're really, really late. So if the two people who are here, if you can save your questions perhaps for the break, if that's okay, and come up and ask. Mike, I think you've got a Scotland-based question as well that you can.
Covered that
We've
earlier.
done that over lunch.
Okay, good, done over lunch. Right, so we're going to wrap up now. What I would say is that out at the registration desk, there's an IHE briefing on the consultation, which pulls out all the important things for alternative and independent providers. So whether you're in the designation system or you're in the Tier 4 system, you're entering the register, take a look at that. It references specific page numbers in the bigger documents to make things easier to find. So go and grab one of those. There's only about 50 copies, so don't stampede. But it would be, if you need that as well, you can give us an email and we'll send that out. And our consultation response will be available publicly in the next few weeks so that you can use that to help inform what you might want to say in terms of your responses. So let's give a round of applause to Rob and Jenny coming this afternoon.